Darkness has a strange way of preserving secrets. It tucks them away in boardrooms, private islands, and smiling photographs taken at charity galas. But eventually, every shadow learns to speak. And in early 2025, the silence surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, one of the most protected men in modern criminal history, finally began to fracture. It didn't start with a press conference or a whistleblower or even a courtroom leak. It started with a door. A sealed door buried deep inside the federal archives. A door the public had been told wasn't ready to be opened. A door that contained 20,000 pages of depositions, flight logs, witness accounts, emails, and quietly redacted names. For years, every attempt to unseal these documents was met with one answer. It would cause reputational harm. But the real translation was far simpler. Too many people in too many powerful places had too much to lose. And yet, on a cold January morning, the lock finally snapped. Not because federal prosecutors suddenly grew brave, not because politicians demanded answers, but because survivors, women who had been ignored, dismissed, and buried behind wealth, kept pushing. Their persistence forced the courts to open the vault. And when the judge signed the order, everything they'd been hiding was suddenly exposed to the world. This chapter begins at that exact moment. A long, sterile corridor, a stack of folders sealed with red tape, and a clerk who looked like she was handling radiation instead of paper. She placed the first box down gently, almost reverently. Inside, scattered across yellowing pages, were the threads of a network so vast, so meticulously layered, that investigators privately admitted they had never seen anything like it. But when the world first heard the files were being unsealed, the reaction wasn't curiosity. It was fear, confusion, and a single question running to the public like static. What exactly are they hiding? Court reporters, legal analysts, and attorneys gathered like hunters around a lantern. Every page felt like pulling back a curtain someone powerful had nailed shut. Some names appeared openly, those already dragged through the mud. But other sections were blacked out with a thickness that suggested not caution, but panic. Still, patterns began to form. Repeated dates, repeated flights, repeated visits, repeated mentions of young women whose lives had been shattered, then stitched together only long enough to hold a testimony. Inside the documents, one thing became painfully clear. Epstein wasn't working alone. He wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't even the center of the web. He was a hub, a gatekeeper connecting people who had far more influence, far more access, and far more to lose than he ever did. But the most chilling section wasn't about politicians, celebrities, billionaires, or lawyers. It was the girls. Their stories were quiet, almost whispered between lines of legal jargon. Yet they carried a weight that crushed everything around them. Pages describe how some victims were contacted, groomed, transported, and scheduled like commodities on an inventory sheet. One deposition written, in trembling handwriting read, "I told him I was 15. He said it didn't matter." Another simply said, "They told me this was normal." No matter how many times the media tried to reduce the case to a list of names, the survivors were the center. Their voices were the core of the fire. And buried among those voices were timelines that didn't just implicate individuals. They implicated systems, private security firms, charitable organizations used as smokescreens, shell companies operating out of empty office suites, and financial transfers that suggested a flow of money bigger than any personal misconduct case should ever require. But the biggest revelation from Chapter 1 is this. The documents were never meant to see daylight. In one internal note scribbled by a federal official, the wording was stark. Release of the full set is not recommended. Risk high. Risk of what? Embarrassment? Legal retaliation? Or something darker? Like exposing an entire structure of protection built over decades? The truth, as the documents hinted, was that Epstein's world operated like a private ecosystem. One where favors were currency, silence was protection, and victims were invisible. When the court finally unsealed the first batch of pages, there was a moment, barely a heartbeat, where the world held its breath. Then the first headline dropped, then another, and another. But even as social media exploded, Legal analysts noticed something more subtle. The documents were incomplete. Entire sections reference evidence still hidden behind sealed orders. Key witnesses mentioned events that were nowhere in the release files. A pattern of missing attachments suggested there was more, far more, lurking in the dark. And it was in that silence, that gap between what was revealed and what was withheld, that the most disturbing questions began to form. Questions about Epstein's death. Questions about the accomplices who vanished. Questions about the names that kept resurfacing in diaries and phone logs and flight manifests, but somehow never in handcuffs. Chapter 1 closes with a single box. A box containing the first 200 pages. A box that was supposed to destroy reputations. A box that instead exposed something worse. A system built to protect predators and bury victims. And as investigators turned to the next folder, one chilling thought echoed through the room. If this is just the beginning, what horrors lie in the pages that haven't been opened yet? The first box opened the door. The second box revealed the truth. When investigators reached into the next stack of files, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The pages felt heavier, not physically, but emotionally. These weren't legal motions or procedural briefs. These were voices. Voices that had been silenced for years by NDAs, threats, bribes, and the invisible machinery of power. And the first document lying on top was a diary, a small, spiral-bound notebook. The kind a teenage girl would use to write about school, crushes, and dreams. But this one was different. Inside, written in looping purple ink, were entries that read like confessions whispered into the dark. He said I'd be safe. They told me this was my chance. I don't know how to leave. The girl who wrote those words was 17 when the diary stopped. Her name had been redacted, replaced with black squares. Yet her story bled through every page. She wasn't the first victim. She wasn't the last. But she was one of the few who tried to document what was happening to her while she was still inside the machine. Attached to her notebook was a deposition recorded years later. Her voice, shaky, quiet, told a story the world still doesn't fully understand. I wasn't chosen. I was recruited. That word, recruited, appeared again and again in the documents. It reframed the entire case. Epstein wasn't randomly targeting young women. He had a system, a method, a network, recruiters, handlers, gatekeepers, women who had once been victims themselves, groomed into becoming part of the engine. The documents detailed how young girls were approached at malls, beaches, parks, school parking lots. The pitch was always the same. Do you want to make some money? You're really pretty, you know. He can help your family. You'll only have to go once. But once was never true. Once was a hook. Once was a test. Once was the point where innocence met a trap it couldn't escape. One survivor described being driven to Epstein's mansion by an older woman with a calm voice and an expensive smile. She remembered the hallway smelling like lavender and bleach. She remembered a massage table, and she remembered a line that kept echoing through her nightmares. It's normal. Everyone does it. The more pages investigators turned, the more apparent the machine became. Behind every name was another name. Behind every victim was someone who brought her there, someone who convinced her, someone who earned money off her trauma. The network wasn't accidental. It was engineered. But the most disturbing detail wasn't how big the network was. It was who protected it. Hidden in the margins of the files were emails, real, time-stamped emails, between federal officials, private attorneys, and individuals whose identities remained sealed. They didn't discuss the girls. They didn't discuss the crimes. They discussed optics. Revealing too much may create unnecessary public instability. This information could damage important partnerships. Reputation-sensitive material should be handled carefully. These weren't criminals talking. These were the people tasked with delivering justice. Across hundreds of pages, patterns emerged. Delayed investigations without explanation. Witness reports lost or misfiled. Leads flagged as not actionable despite clear evidence. Interviews cut short when certain names were mentioned. Victims encouraged to move forward instead of pressing charges. The survivors had always insisted that Epstein didn't act alone. The documents didn't just confirm it. They proved it. One confidential witness described a house filled with security cameras, not for protection, but for leverage. Every interaction was recorded, every visitor logged, every secret stored away like insurance. Epstein didn't just exploit victims. He collected powerful men's skeletons, and that made him untouchable. One victim's attorney stated bluntly, "Every time we got close, someone shut the door, but the survivors were the ones who refused to let those doors stay shut." Buried deep in Box 2 was a transcript labeled simply, Testimony 14B. The woman speaking had been 15 when she first met Epstein. She was in her 30s now. When asked why she kept coming forward, she answered, "Because I realized the people protecting him were stronger than the people investigating him." Her words cracked the room open. For the first time, investigators understood the scale of the cover-up. This wasn't corruption born from panic. It was corruption baked into the foundation of the entire case. A structure designed to keep certain names out of headlines, certain testimonies out courtroom, and certain files sealed forever. But the girls kept talking. Testimony after testimony revealed identical patterns. A wealthy man would call Epstein. Epstein would call a handler. The handler would call a girl. The girl would be told to dress nice. The driver would pick her up, and she would disappear for hours. Some girls returned withdrawn, shaking, or silent. Some didn't return at all, and the world never asked why. The second box made it clear this wasn't scandal. It was a pipeline, a system with recruiters, transporters, cleaners, and protectors. A machine fueled by vulnerability and shielded by power. By the time investigators closed Box 2, the room felt colder, not because of what they'd read, but because of what they knew was coming next. If Box 2 revealed the victims' voices and the network that preyed on them, Box 3 would reveal the names behind the curtain. The ones who benefited, the ones who visited, the ones who were protected by silence. And in the center of it all lay the question no one could ignore. If Epstein was just a gatekeeper, then who was he guarding the gates for? The moment investigators lifted the lid on Box 3, the air changed. This wasn't like the others. This wasn't testimony. This wasn't diaries or victim statements. This was documentation. Cold, detailed, unavoidable. The first folder inside was marked with 3 words. Travel log, master. No initials. No dates. Just a title that felt more like a warning. Inside were pages of passenger manifests, each one outlining flights that crossed oceans, borders, and time zones. The infamous jets, nicknamed by victims and later by the media, were mapped in excruciating detail. Page after page listed takeoff times, landing times, fuel stops, and, most importantly, names. Some were expected, some were rumored, some were startlingly ordinary, but others were names spoken only in whispers. Names protected by sealed court orders. Names that had vanished from public records long before the scandal broke. These weren't just passengers. They were patrons. The hierarchy became obvious the deeper investigators read. There were Tier 1, the known associates. People whose friendships with Epstein were public knowledge. Businessmen, financiers, models, entertainers, academics. Their presence wasn't surprising. It was almost mundane. Tier 2, the shielded inner circle. Individuals who appeared frequently but rarely publicly. Diplomats, political strategists, major donors, real estate magnates. They lived in the background of power, operating silently, pulling strings quietly. Tier 3, the names behind the curtain. These were sealed, redacted so thoroughly that only fragments remained. A senator's initial here, a royal's partial title there, a corporate titan's monogram tucked into the corner of a manifest. Someone wanted these names hidden, not for privacy, for protection. Attached to the logs was a memo from a federal liaison dated years before Epstein's arrest. The identities of certain individuals must remain redacted to avoid destabilizing diplomatic relationships. Destabilizing relationships. 3 words that said everything without saying anything at all. The next folder was even more disturbing. It was labeled Visitor Entry Island. The island, the place survivors spoke about with shaking voices and distant eyes. The log showed foot traffic that stretched across a decade. billionaires, actors, scientists, sheiks, princes, art collectors, media executives, tech founders, political donors, ambassadors. Some stayed for hours, some stayed for days, some stayed multiple times a year. A handwritten note on the inside cover read, "Visitors expected discretion." Expected, not requested. Expected. Behind those logs were photographic stills from surveillance cameras, grainy, time-stamped frames showing silhouettes entering doorways, walking across patios, stepping out of boats, faces partially obscured, never quite clear, always just out of reach. The kind of images that could ruin an empire if they were ever allowed to surface. One investigator wrote in a margin, "These cameras weren't for security. They were for leverage." Epstein didn't just host powerful men. He documented them. He archived them. He collected them the way others collected art. But travel logs and visitor lists were only the first layer. The next document revealed the true architecture of Epstein's world. A flowchart, hand-drawn, complex, spiderweb-like. At the center, but not at the top. He wasn't the king. He was a broker. Lines branched upward toward titles, not names. Investor 1, royal liaison, state asset, foreign benefactor, foundation board private. These weren't people who visited for pleasure. These were people who funded the infrastructure. People who benefited politically, financially, or socially. People above Epstein. People whose identities never made it into the news. One note circled in red read, "Secure funding contingent on continued operations." Continued operations. A phrase that hit like a stone. This wasn't a man with a system. This was a system with a man. Epstein was a hub. The island, the properties, the planes, they were tools. The real power lay in whoever stood above him, feeding the pipeline and shielding it when necessary. And those people were protected with precision. In the next folder was a series of legal communications, requests to delay subpoenas, files marked as non-essential, instructions to limit public exposure, direct quotes instructing agencies to avoid naming high-value individuals. In one email exchange, a lawyer representing an unidentified client wrote, "My client trusts this matter will remain contained. Any unnecessary disclosure is unacceptable." Another replied, "We understand. The department has no intention of making waves." Contained. No waves. Meanwhile, survivors were begging to be heard. The next set of documents was perhaps the most chilling of all. Profiles. Internal notes on certain individuals were stored like classified intelligence. These weren't criminal files. They were behavioral analyses, psych reports, preferences, and red flags. Information designed to be used, either as leverage or for recruitment. Some entries were heavily redacted. Some were entirely blacked out. But one paragraph, left inexplicably untouched, stood out. These individuals offer protection. Their reputations are essential. Their interests must be accommodated discreetly. Any disruption to their standing could compromise the longevity of the enterprise. Enterprise. That was the word used. Not crime, not scheme, not operation. Enterprise. It suggested structure, coordination, a hierarchy with layers purposely hidden from the public eye. By the time investigators finished Box 3, a quiet terror settled into the room. Because this box didn't just reveal who visited Epstein, it revealed who he answered to. And that truth changed everything. The island wasn't the center. The mansion wasn't the center. The jet wasn't the center. They were branches. Branches attached to a tree with roots that stretched far deeper than anyone had imagined. The kind of roots that disappear into governments, corporations, foundations, and dynasties. The kind of roots people kill to protect. As the final page of Box 3 turned, one question lingered in the air like smoke. If these were the visitors, then who were the architects? Before investigators could even open Box 4, the warning started. A quiet knock on the door. A whispered conversation in a hallway. A subtle reminder from a supervisor. Be careful with this one. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't caution. It was fear. And once the lid came off, the reason became painfully clear. This box wasn't about victims. It wasn't about visitors. It was about the war behind the scenes. A war fought in emails, closed-door meetings, shredded documents, corrupted files, and investigators who suddenly found themselves reassigned, relocated, or quietly dismissed. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't oversight. It was sabotage. The first clue, a file that never existed. Near the top of box 4 was a folder labeled Evidence 01A. Inside was a single page. One line, typed, centered. This file was destroyed pursuant to administrative protocol. No signature, no date, no explanation. But investigators recognized a reference code instantly. It matched the inventory list for items seized from a certain Palm Beach property. Items survivors claimed contained physical evidence of abuse. The objects were never logged, never tested, never returned. They simply vanished. Attached to the page was a sticky note from a former detective who had since retired. We were told to stop asking questions. The second clue, the whistleblower who disappeared. The next folder held transcripts from internal communications. Among them was a report filed by a junior analyst, someone who had only been with the department for 18 months. She noticed irregularities in the chain of custody, time gaps, files checked out with no signatures, boxes moved without documentation. Her report triggered a meeting, not a commendation. A meeting. She entered the conference room with a binder, printouts, timestamps. She never left with her job. Her exit interview was included in the folder. It was only one sentence long. Irreconcilable differences with departmental expectations. No mention of misconduct. No mention of error. Just a quiet silencing of the one person who dared to say something was wrong. A handwritten margin note, likely from the investigator compiling these boxes, added, "She was right." The third clue, evidence that was tampered with. Midway through the box was a plastic sleeve containing photographs of the server room, rows of machines, blinking lights, cooling vents. The metadata timestamps, barely visible in the corner, revealed a chilling detail. The drives had been accessed 2 days before the warrant was executed. When investigators arrived at Epstein's property, they found missing hard drives, smashed DVR systems, replaced wiring, fresh patchwork on camera mounts, key cables removed, backup servers wiped clean. Someone had been there first. Not burglars, not random intruders. Professionals. The cleanup was precise, surgical. Evidence wasn't destroyed. It was curated. Only certain data was removed. Someone knew exactly what needed to disappear. Attached to the photographs was a memo. Unknown individuals gained entry. No signs of forced access. Keypad logs missing. Keypad logs missing. That meant whoever entered had authorization. The fourth clue, the internal freeze. The next set of documents detailed a different kind of sabotage. One that didn't take place at a crime scene, but inside government agencies. 2 weeks into the investigation, a temporary freeze was placed on all interdepartmental requests. Emails were halted. Information sharing suspended. Cross-agency cooperation ended. The official reason was resource overload. But a deeper look revealed something darker. A private message thread between agents showed growing panic. They're blocking us. We can't access half our requests. Files are being rerouted. We're losing ground. One agent wrote, "We're being stopped by our own people." The freeze lasted 69 days. Long enough for evidence to fade, memories to blur, leads to go cold. When communication finally resumed, dozens of documents were missing from the system. Deleted? Moved? Altered? No one could prove it, which meant no one could stop it. The fifth clue, a pattern of quiet reassignments. Buried deeper in the box was a list of personnel changes. A spreadsheet printed on cheap office paper. Over the course of 1 year, 9 investigators were reassigned from the case. Not transferred, not promoted, reassigned, some to unrelated divisions, some to distant offices, some to administrative roles that kept them far from field work. Their replacements were described by one internal memo as less sensitive to potential political complications. Political complications, not justice, not accuracy, not truth, politics. 3 investigators submitted formal complaints. All 3 complaints were dismissed without review. All 3 investigators later left their respective agencies. The 6th clue, the evidence locker that went dark. At the bottom of box 4 was a security log, printed from a facility that stored seized materials. Between 2:14 a.m. and 3:07 a.m. on a certain date, a power outage was recorded. Only one wing was affected. Only one section within that wing. Only one locker within that section. Epstein's. When power was restored, 2 envelopes were missing. One containing photographs. One containing handwritten notes. One containing a set of USB drives. No cameras captured the break. No alarms triggered. No employees were on site. Whoever orchestrated the outage knew the system's vulnerabilities. This wasn't sabotage from the outside. It was sabotage from someone with the map. What Box 4 revealed. By the time investigators closed Box 4, a dark truth had emerged. The case didn't crumble on its own. It was broken from the inside. Every missing file, every reassigned agent, every silenced whistleblower, every wiped drive, every unexplained delay, every redacted name. These weren't accidents. They were decisions. And the people making them weren't protecting Epstein. They were protecting someone bigger, someone higher, someone who had more to lose than a financier with a private island. As investigators prepared for Box 5, they finally asked a question no one wanted spoken aloud. If this much effort went into destroying the truth, what truth were they so terrified of the world discovering? For months, investigators have been peeling back layers of decay. Corruption, sabotage, erasure, like surgeons dissecting a body long after heartbeat had faded. But Box 5 was different, not because it contained more secrets, but because it contained what remained after the secrets had been burned, buried, or carried off by unseen hands. These were the fragments that survived the fire, a map of a machine that once operated in the shadows, but was now collapsing under its own weight. And at the center of that collapse was a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. The first revelation, a system without a face. Inside Box 5 lay a series of memos, short, cryptic, often unsigned. One read, "Operation stable. No direct oversight required." Another, "Ensure separation between liaison tiers." Another, circled in pen, "Redundancy established. Individuals replaceable." Replaceable. The memos confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. This wasn't a hierarchy with a king. It was a mechanism, a machine built to operate even if any single part was removed. Epstein wasn't the architect. He was a node, a piece of a larger, multi-layered structure involving financiers, diplomats, intelligence contacts, and private entities with motivations that had nothing to do with Epstein's personal desires. A machine that could outlive him, and nearly did. The second revelation, the leak that changed everything. Near the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of an encrypted conversation, one that had been leaked anonymously to a journalist years after Epstein's death. The messages read like a confession written by someone with too much knowledge and too little time. There were multiple handlers. Certain individuals were protected by agreement. Evidence was destroyed to preserve state relationships. He knew too much. The final message was the most chilling of all. The island was never the center. It was a stage. A stage, meaning the purpose wasn't secrecy, but performance. A controlled space where the right people could be compromised, observed, studied, and leveraged. Epstein didn't build the island to hide crimes. He built it to record them. And the recordings, those elusive pieces of evidence everyone still believes exist, were mentioned in the messages. Backups were moved to offshore storage. 3 locations. Unknown custodians, meaning some footage survived. Some documents escaped destruction. Some truths never died. They were simply moved, passed into hands investigators still couldn't trace. Hands powerful enough to hold the world hostage. The third revelation, when the machine cracked. Another folder held a stack of reports from multiple agencies, each describing a moment, a single fracture point. when the invisible armor protecting the Enterprise started to split. It didn't happen because of a whistleblower. It didn't happen because of one survivor. It didn't happen because of one agent. It happened because the system lost coordination. When Epstein was arrested the first time, certain individuals expected protection. When he wasn't shielded the second time, panic followed. When he died in custody, under circumstances still disputed by experts, panic turned into something worse: confusion. Without a central node coordinating favors, calls, bribes, assurances, and denials, the Enterprise froze, then fractured, then collapsed under the weight of its own secrecy. The truth didn't emerge because someone chose transparency. The truth emerged because no one was left to hold the doors shut. The fourth revelation, what they failed to bury. Deeper in Box 5 were fragments, literal fragments, of documents half-shredded but later reconstructed by analysts. Words sliced in half. Sentences missing beginnings or endings. Dates with only months and years. Names reduced to initials. But enough survived to map out what the machine once looked like. A network of recruiters positioned in targeted regions. Financial channels moving money through charities, shell companies, and consulting firms. A communications chain routed through foreign jurisdictions. A list of individuals labeled priority passengers. A roster of entities designated as silent guarantors. That last term, silent guarantors, appeared in several documents. It referred to individuals or institutions that agreed, formally or informally, to keep operations quiet in exchange for political alignment, financial benefits, or information leverage, meaning the Enterprise was not just protected by individuals, but by nations, and those nations had reasons to keep the truth buried. The fifth revelation, what the world was allowed to see. The final section of Box 5 contained media advisories, draft statements written for agencies, filtered through multiple layers of approval. They detailed in real time how the public narrative was shaped, which facts were allowed to emerge, which names were cleared for release, which connections were downplayed, which patterns were labeled coincidental, which evidence was deemed non-probative, which lines of inquiry were shut down to avoid public confusion. A note attached to one document explained the core strategy. Contain the story to the individual. Avoid implication of systems. Contain it. Shrink it. Reduce it to one man, one villain, one monster. A single rotten branch that could be cut off and thrown away. But the truth was never about one man. It was about the roots. Roots that stretch so deep into governments, corporations, intelligence services, and global elites that exposing the entire system would destabilize more than a few reputations. It would destabilize institutions. The final revelation, the question that remains. Near the bottom of Box 5 was a final note. No signature, no date, just a sentence typed in a standard government font. Certain details will remain sealed for national security purposes. National security. Two words that transformed a criminal enterprise into something else entirely. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, a protected asset. Even now, years later, investigators believe only a fraction of the truth has emerged. But one thing became undeniable. Epstein wasn't the beginning. He wasn't the end. He wasn't the architect. He was the doorway through which a machine operated, and the doorway through which it finally collapsed. The girl's testimony survived. Some files survived. Fragments survived. Truth survived, not whole, not complete, but alive. And in the final quiet of Box 5, one question lingered. If this is what they couldn't hide, what truth still lies sealed, waiting for the world to be ready? The lid closed with a soft thud. The room stayed silent. Some stories end with justice. Some end with closure. But this one ends with a shadow. A reminder that even in the brightest rooms, there are truths powerful enough to remain in the dark.